The port city of Wilmington in the 1860s carried a peculiar mixture of bustle and rot. Ships lined the docks with their masts pointing like accusatory fingers toward the grey sky, and the streets reeked of fish, tar, and the damp musk of marshland. The Cole household stood not far from the waterfront, its brick walls and white columns projecting a stern authority that mirrored the character of its master, Officer Samuel Cole. The house was well known in the neighborhood, not for warmth or hospitality, but for the sharp discipline that dripped from its walls like cold rain from a roof. Inside that household lived and labored Ruth Hayes, the cook and servant who endured the brunt of its cruelties. Ruth had been born on a small farm outside Nashville. Her mother died when she was still a girl, and she was raised by an aunt who believed in the strict discipline of survival. From her aunt she learned to make meals from the simplest scraps, to coax flavor from gardens and orchards, and to endure hardship with silence. By the time Ruth reached her teenage years, she had the scowls of a seasoned cook. Those who tasted her food remarked on the quiet confidence with which she shaped simple cornmeal into golden bread or simmered beans until they carried the depth of meat. When Samuel Cole's household sought a cook, Ruth's name was spoken with respect, and she was offered promises wages she could send home, a room of her own, and the dignity of steady work. Those promises dissolved within weeks of her arrival. Samuel Cole claimed the economy of war required wages to be cut. The key to her room was confiscated, she was told, to teach obedience. Her recipes, which she had carried in memory from her aunt's kitchen, were written down and presented by Lydia Cole, the mistress, as her own family creations. The very credit Ruth deserved was erased, and in its place came suspicion. More than once she was accused of theft when food went missing, though the true culprit was waste and excess from the family's table. The humiliations were relentless. One winter evening, when guests filled the parlor, Lydia declared that Ruth had oversalted a tray of biscuits. As punishment, she was made to kneel before the visitors, her head bowed while Lydia explained that a servant must learn humility the hard way. The guests laughed, sipping wine as if her degradation were a form of entertainment. The Coles' teenage son, swollen with entitlement, discovered a new sport in pelting Ruth with bread crusts as she worked. He boasted that he could hit her cheek or forehead at will, and his laughter rang louder when she did not raise her hands to defend herself. Samuel himself, returning from drills or inspections, would wipe grease from his fingers onto her apron in front of friends. The act was treated as a harmless joke, yet the message was clear. Ruth was a rag to be used, not a woman with dignity. Outside the walls of the house, Ruth found no refuge. At the market, when she reached to pay for flour or beans, vendors glanced at the burn scars running down her arms and mocked her for being clumsy. "Careful with that fire, girl," one man jeered, loud enough for others to hear. "Best not ruin another kitchen." She lowered her eyes and gathered her goods in silence, swallowing the sting of ridicule. On Sundays, the cruelty reached a sharper edge. While the family dined in a polished room with candles and silver, Ruth was ordered to take her portion into a storage closet. "No appetite survives the sight of scars," Lydia declared, ensuring that Ruth ate among brooms, barrels, and dust, hidden from view like a shameful secret. Even her competence was twisted into mockery. The meals that drew praise were attributed to Lydia's delicate touch, while the slightest mishap, a chipped dish, a soup not hot enough, was heaped upon Ruth as evidence of incompetence. Guests learned to laugh at the stories Lydia and Grace, Samuel's sister, told about the clumsy cook. They delighted in the image of Ruth scrambling on her knees to clean broken china while others sipped wine and murmured about family grace. The structure of the household was built on inspection and suspicion. Ruth's trunk was searched without warning. Eggs were counted each morning to ensure none had gone missing. Every knife was checked for sharpness, as though she might steal one to cause harm. Her room, when she was permitted to sleep there, was entered at random. Even the quiet hours of night offered no peace, for the sound of Lydia's shoes could appear outside her door, testing whether she was awake, or the teenage boy might throw pebbles at her window just to laugh at her startled face. In these daily degradations, Ruth learned not to weep but to observe. She memorized the creaks of the floorboards, the places where Lydia's slippers clicked loudest. the narrow corridor through which every dish must pass on its way to the dining table. She noticed the guard at the back door fell asleep by 9 each evening, leaving the household less watched than it seemed. She saw how Lydia insisted on fresh rendered lard for her cabbage stew, and how it was always boiled in the same heavy iron pan by the stove. She kept a folded cloth tucked away near the hearth and learned the feel of the handle of that pan as though it were a part of her own hand. The humiliations carved grooves into her days, each insult laying another stone upon her back. Yet beneath the silence of her bowed head, Ruth was not broken. She carried her memories like a blade hidden in fabric, her mother's absence, her aunt's lessons, the farm where she first learned to stir a pot with patience. She remembered that promises could be lies, that respect could be stolen, but cruelty, piled high enough, always grew top-heavy. Sooner or later, it must tip and fall. And Ruth Hayes, silent and resilient, was already preparing for the moment when it would. In the Cole household, cruelty was not an accident, but a system, a ritual as polished as the silver Lydia set upon the dining table. Samuel Cole ruled his home as he ruled his regiment, with blunt command, no explanation given, no dissent tolerated. His footsteps in the hall carried the same clipped precision as on the parade ground, and when he entered the kitchen, he expected immediate obedience. He enjoyed the weight of his authority most when it bore down on Ruth Hayes. Her silence, which might have been dignity, he treated as defiance. Her careful movements, which might have been patience, he called slowness. He made a spectacle of correcting her, cuffing the back of her head with the edge of his hand if a pot simmered too long, or forcing her to stand with a tray of food until her arms trembled as punishment for being weak. If Samuel's power was blunt force, Lydia's was sharper, like a knife pressed just hard enough to pierce skin without bleeding. She turned food into a ewpn of humiliation. If bread was not cut evenly, she ordered Ruth to slice another loaf, sneering that a woman who could not measure should never be trusted with a kitchen. If the soup was not hot enough, she demanded that Ruth taste it in front of the family, as though to prove her incompetence by burning her tongue. Lydia had an instinct for cruelty that found its purest expression at Sunday dinners, when guests filled the long dining room. There she would tell stories of the clumsy cook, with a laugh that disguised malice as amusement. The guests joined in, and Ruth, standing in the corner with folded hands, endured the sting of their laughter like blows. Grace, Samuel's younger sister, was frivolous in her cruelty. Where Samuel wanted obedience and Lydia sought humiliation, Grace wanted entertainment. She made the servants run with pots from one end of the kitchen to the other, clapping her hands and laughing as if it were a children's game. She dropped forks on the floor deliberately just to see Ruth kneel and pick them up. Sometimes she overturned a dish herself, blaming Ruth and watching with delight as the cook scrambled to clean the mess. Grace's friends repeated the stories elsewhere in Wilmington, making Ruth a figure of ridicule even beyond the household. The rituals of control extended to every corner of Ruth's life. Samuel demanded surprise inspections of her trunk, unfolding her clothes, shaking out her few possessions, and smirking when he found nothing. Lydia counted every egg in the pantry, every measure of sugar, every pinch of salt, convinced that servants survived only by theft. Even knives were checked and locked away, as if Ruth might snatch one in a moment of madness. The teenage boy carried this suspicion further, spreading rumors that Ruth had once tried to poison food. Though it was a lie, Lydia repeated it as though it were fact, and guests began to glance uneasily at their plates, smiling only when Samuel reassured them it was under control. To endure such a household required not only silence, but calculation. Ruth began to study the rhythms of the house with the same precision she once devoted to recipes. She noted that the guard by the back door always drank himself into slumber after 9 o'clock, slumped on a stool with his musket across his knees. She noticed how Lydia demanded fresh rendered lard for her cabbage stew, a task that filled the kitchen with the smell of boiling fat. The heavy iron pan used for this rendering became as familiar in Ruth's hands as a weapon. She learned the creaks of the floorboards, the places where a careless step would betray movement, and the exact distance from stove to corridor where every dish must pass on its way to the table. Her preparation was not born of impulse or sudden rage. It was cold, deliberate, the slow accumulation of knowledge by someone who had no other defense. Each humiliation became another reminder that she lived in a house where her humanity was denied, where even her scale was twisted into ridicule. But Ruth was not without memory. She remembered her aunt's words from the farm. That silence could be a shield, but it could also be a knife if one waited long enough. She folded a cloth and kept it tucked near the stove, ready for the day when it would be needed. She learned the weight of the iron pan when full, and how long boiling fat would stay hot enough to burn. She placed these facts in her mind as carefully as she once placed herbs in a stew. Meanwhile, the humiliations intensified. At one dinner, Grace ordered Ruth to crawl under the table to retrieve a dropped spoon, laughing as guests peeked down at her as though she were an animal. On another evening, Samuel demanded that Ruth carry a platter so heavy she staggered, then laughed when the teenage boy darted forward to trip her. When the platter crashed, the boy shouted triumphantly that it proved her clumsiness. Ruth's silence in these moments was interpreted as proof she accepted her inferiority, but inside, silence was only the still surface of a deeper current. The household operated like a stage where the family performed power, and Ruth was their chosen prop. But props do not remain still forever. Each cruel ritual gave her more knowledge. Which chair Lydia always chose at the head of the table, where Samuel's back was when he rose for a toast, how Grace leaned forward to watch the dishes arrive. These were not idle observations, but deliberate notes, as though Ruth were writing a recipe for retribution. By the close of each day, after the fires were banked and the house hushed, Ruth lay awake on her narrow cot. She listened to the guard's snores, to the settling of beams in the old house, to the far-off sound of ships groaning in Wilmington's harbor. In the dark, she imagined the heavy pan in her hand, the hiss of fat, the sudden silence of voices cut off by fire. Her imagination was not wild fantasy, but careful rehearsal, as cold and methodical as the inspections she endured. The Coles believed they were tightening their hold over her, but they were only teaching her the weaknesses of their own power. The cruelty of Samuel, Lydia, and Grace was meant to break Ruth Hayes into obedience. Instead, it hardened her into preparation. In the cracks of their laughter, she was already shaping the moment when the humiliation they so loved would turn back upon them, hotter than boiling lard. The winter gathering at the Cole household was announced weeks in advance, spoken of in Wilmington's parlors and shops as a celebration of family grace. Lydia Cole relished such occasions, moments when she could arrange her table with polished silver and embroidered cloths, showing the town that her household remained unshaken despite rumors of wartime shortages. Invitations were sent to officers from Samuel's regiment, merchants from the docks, and neighbors eager for spectacle. For days the house was in upheaval, every rug beaten, every candle polished, every chair arranged. And through it all, Ruth Hayes labored in the kitchen, her hands steady, her face unreadable. Lydia's cruelty sharpened in proportion to the grandeur of the event. She demanded that Ruth produce a spread of meats, pies, stews, and cakes, as if the household were untouched by scarcity. Chickens were plucked until the kitchen reeked, lard rendered until steam coated the ceiling beams, flour beaten into dough until Ruth's arms ached. At every stage, Lydia inspected, not to help but to find fault. "The gravy is thin," she declared, pouring it into a new pot and demanding it be thickened. "The pie crust lacks shine," she said, forcing Ruth to rebaste it until her hands grew slick with butter. Samuel strode in at intervals, barking that the portions must be doubled, that no guest should think the Coles less than generous. Grace amused herself by dipping fingers into sauces, laughing as she smeared them across Ruth's apron before wandering away. The evening arrived with the house glowing in candlelight. Guests filed into the dining room, their boots clicking on the polished floor, their laughter carrying the confidence of people who had never known real hunger. Lydia moved among them like a queen, her gown rustling, her smile bright, her voice pitched to carry. Samuel poured drinks and spoke of military discipline. Grace flitted about with the air of a hostess, though her role was only to amuse. Ruth remained in the kitchen until summoned, standing beside the iron pan where fat bubbled and spat, releasing its acrid scent into the air. She had prepared every dish, memorized every detail, and now she waited. The folded cloth tucked discreetly by the stove, the weight of the pan familiar in her hand. The first humiliations came swiftly, as if rehearsed. When Ruth carried in a platter of roasted fowl, the coal boy darted forward to trip her, drawing a chorus of laughter as the guests watched her stumble but not fall. She steadied herself, her eyes lowered, the pan still balanced in her hands. Grace called out that the cook danced better than she served, and the room rippled with amusement. Lydia, ever the orchestrator of cruelty, clapped her hands and declared that Ruth must bring in the lard pan itself to demonstrate how hard we work for our guests. It was said with mockery dressed as pride, but the guests, eager for entertainment, encouraged it. Ruth nodded once and returned to the kitchen. The iron pan hissed as she lifted it from the stove, cloth wrapped tight around the handle. The fat shimmered golden under the kitchen lamps, a liquid mirror reflecting fire. She carried it carefully, each step measured, through the narrow corridor that connected kitchen to dining room. The floor creaked where she expected, the air thick with heat and anticipation. When she entered the room, conversation paused for a moment, eyes drawn to the strange sight of a servant carrying a pan meant for the hidden labor of kitchens. Lydia smiled cruelly, raising her glass to offer a toast. Samuel rose beside her, his chest puffed, his hand already lifting to command silence. Grace leaned forward, eager for another spectacle. It was at that moment, poised between ridicule and ritual, that Ruth moved. She steadied the pan, her arms unwavering, and then with a single tilt of her wrists, she poured its contents across the table. The boiling fat splashed in a wide arc, striking Samuel first, then Lydia, then Grace. Their laughter broke into shrieks as the liquid burned skin, soaked fabric, ignited the edge of the embroidered tablecloth. Flames leapt upward, candles toppled, the rich feast turned in an instant into chaos. The guests surged to their feet, knocking over chairs, some rushing forward, others stumbling back in horror. But Ruth did not flee. She set the emptied pan on the center of the table, the iron clanging against wood, and stood upright. For the first time in years, she was taller than those around her, not bent, not kneeling, but standing in her full height. Her face did not twist with rage, nor break into triumph. It was calm, her gaze steady, her breathing even. Neighbors who rushed in from the parlor expecting disorder found instead a scene both chaotic and strangely ordered. A burning table, screaming hosts, and one woman standing utterly still in the smoke. The aftermath unfolded swiftly. Servants and guests struggled to smother the flames, throwing wine, yanking down curtains, beating with cloths. Samuel groaned, his face half burned. Lydia clawed at her gown, the fabric smoldering. Grace wailed, her laughter gone, her arms blistered. The boy who had mocked Ruth shrank into a corner, pale and silent. Through it all, Ruth did not move, did not speak. When at last the fire was contained, when the table lay charred and the air thick with smoke, she was seized, accused on the spot of savagery. Some guests shouted that she was mad. Others muttered that she had been plotting for years. No one spoke of the humiliations she had endured, only of the outrage of the moment. By morning, newspapers carried the story. They called her deranged, a monster in servant's garb, a threat to respectable households. They described the Coles as victims of unprovoked cruelty, their injuries proof of her barbarity. Ruth was not given space to speak, nor did she try. She answered questions with silence, her face composed. When dragged before the court, she neither pleaded nor protested. The prosecutor painted her as the embodiment of chaos, a creature who had turned on her, betters without cause. Witnesses testified to her strange silences, twisting dignity into menace. The verdict was as certain as it was swift. Guilty. The sentence was fixed. Death by hanging. And still Ruth Hayes said nothing. The days that followed the trial blurred into a single grey stretch of time. Ruth Hayes was kept in a cell behind the Wilmington courthouse, its stone walls damp with coastal air, its barred window opening onto an alley where rats scurried at night. Guards came to look at her, some with curiosity, others with contempt. They expected pleas, outbursts, prayers for mercy. None came. Ruth sat on the rough bench, her hands folded in her lap, her posture as straight as if she still stood in the coal kitchen. She accepted food without comment, drank water without expression, and when spoken to, answered only if the question demanded a word. Even then, she chose the smallest reply. Her silence unsettled those who expected contrition. The sentence was announced publicly, execution by hanging on the courthouse green. The date was fixed swiftly, as though the city wished to rid itself of her presence before rumors grew larger. Newspapers carried lurid accounts of the dinner fire, embellishing each detail. Lydia was described as a saintly hostess, scarred for life. Samuel was painted as a disciplined officer, humbled by tragedy. Grace was cast as an innocent young woman who would forever bear the marks of a servant's treachery. Ruth, by contrast, was drawn as a beast of resentment, her silence portrayed as proof of derangement. No mention was made of kneeling punishments, of market jeers, of closets where she ate alone. On the morning of her execution, the air was sharp with winter frost. Townspeople gathered long before the appointed hour, some eager for spectacle, others grim with curiosity. The courthouse bell tolled, and soldiers led Ruth from her cell. She wore a plain grey dress, the same one she had been given weeks earlier, now washed but threadbare. Her hair was tied back simply. There was no tremor in her step, no faltering in her stride. Witnesses remarked afterward that she walked as though she were not the condemned, but the one who had come to witness judgment on others. The gallows stood stark against the pale sky, a wooden frame with rough-hewn steps. The crowd murmured as she mounted them, some expecting a breakdown, others waiting for a final confession. None came. When the rope was placed around her neck, Ruth did not resist. She lifted her eyes to the horizon, steady, unflinching. The minister beside her spoke of sin and forgiveness, urging her to repent. She did not answer. The sheriff asked if she had any last words. Her silence stretched across the crowd, heavy, unsettling. Then the trapdoor fell, and Ruth Hayes died without bowing her head. Her death did not end the story. Within weeks, whispers began to ripple through Wilmington. Servants in kitchens and laundries repeated tales of her humiliations, passing them from house to house. They spoke of the biscuits, the bread crusts, the grease-stained apron, the market jeers, the closet dinners. Each telling sharpened the cruelty of the Coles and softened Ruth into a figure of grim justice. The official accounts in the press could not stop the undercurrent. For every column that called her a monster, there were a dozen quiet voices that called her something else. A woman who had endured too much, a servant who turned the tools of her degradation into weapons. A reminder that cruelty never vanishes, but waits, hotter than boiling fat, until the moment it spills back. The Cole family never recovered its name. Samuel's injuries kept him from active duty. His reputation as a commander overshadowed by whispers that he could not even control his own household. Lydia withdrew from public gatherings, her scarred hands hidden behind gloves, her laughter silenced. Grace, once so eager for company, found doors closed to her, neighbors unwilling to forget the spectacle of that night. The boy who had thrown bread crusts grew into a man marked by shame, known less for his family's status than for the story of what his mocking laughter had unleashed. In time, the Coles left Wilmington, retreating inland to live in obscurity. But Ruth's name remained. In kitchens where servants bent over boiling pots, her story was retold. In laundry yards where women wrung sheets with aching hands, her name was whispered as a warning and a comfort. She became a figure both feared and revered. Feared by those who recognized their own cruelty, revered by those who bore it. Children of servants grew up hearing the tale of Ruth Hayes, the cook who endured until endurance became action, who stood silent while others laughed, and then struck once, so decisively that her silence resounded louder than screams. Years passed, wars shifted, families rose and fell, but the memory remained. Some said Ruth's ghost lingered in kitchens, standing by stoves with folded cloth in hand. Others claimed her story was proof that humiliation could never last forever, that one woman's refusal to break could bend the legacy of an entire family. In Wilmington, the courthouse green where she died became a place children avoided at night, not out of fear of Ruth, but out of fear of what her silence represented. The truth that cruelty, taught long enough, always finds its way back. Thus Ruth Hayes, once mocked as clumsy, dismissed as invisible, and condemned as monstrous, became something else entirely. She became a warning carved not into stone, but into memory, carried on the breath of those who worked unseen. Her story was not written in the official ledgers of the town, but in the whispers of kitchens and the sighs of laundries, in the heat of boiling pots and the scrape of iron pans. Ruth Hayes died unbowed, her gaze steady, her silence unbroken. And in that silence lay her legacy, a reminder that the fires of humiliation, banked long enough, will one day burn hotter than any kitchen flame.